They say money can't buy happiness, but at $27 million I discovered it could certainly buy justice. My story begins not with triumph, but with the scent of chalk dust and printer ink that seemed to follow me everywhere in the Vance household. While my breath carried the mundane essence of homework and late-night studying, it faded to nothing compared to the fresh-cut grass smell from Leo's soccer cleats or the expensive textbook fragrance that clung to Elijah's belongings. In our perfect Cape Cod home in the suburbs of Portland, Oregon, I learned early that some children sparkle while others merely exist in the shadows. The manicured lawns of our Beaverton neighborhood told a story of suburban perfection, but behind our pristine white picket fence, favoritism grew like weeds. Victor Vance, my father, had a way of looking through me as if I were made of glass. Maria, my mother, perfected the art of loving selectively. Every family dinner was a performance where my brothers starred and I served as the forgotten understudy. When I was 12, my mother announced another pregnancy. Victor's eyes lit up with a fervor I'd never seen directed toward me. "It's going to be a boy," he declared with absolute certainty, as if he could will it into existence. I can feel it. That weekend, while most families might have gone on picnics or to the zoo, Victor spent hours painting what would become the nursery a deep blue. It was ritualistic, almost desperate, as if coating those walls could somehow banish the disappointment of having produced a daughter. The morning they decided to abandon me arrived not with rain and gloom, but with brilliant sunshine that mocked the darkness about to engulf my world. I remember the smell of toasted bread and coffee wafting through our kitchen, scents that should have brought comfort but would forever remind me of the most devastating conversation of my young life. Victor sat at our breakfast table, his decision already carved in stone, while Maria stared at her hands, unable to meet my eyes. "You don't belong with us anymore, Isabella," he said with the casual tone one might use to discuss the weather. "There's a better family waiting for you. People who can give you what you need." What I needed, apparently, was anything but them. The children's home sat in the industrial section of East Portland, a gray building with peeling paint that seemed to absorb hope. The smell of bleach couldn't quite mask the underlying odors of too many children in too small a space. I clutched a single-family photograph, the only evidence that I had once belonged somewhere. That night, as sirens wailed in the distance and fluorescent lights hummed overhead, I made a promise to myself that no one would ever have the power to hurt me like this again. What followed were years that taught me survival came in many forms. My first foster family lived in a cramped house in southeast Portland, where 7 children competed for attention, food, and basic kindness. I learned to become invisible, to take up no space, to need nothing. The second family resided in Lake Oswego's pristine neighborhoods, but their warmth evaporated the moment they realized I wouldn't remain a grateful, compliant child forever. They had wanted a baby, not a traumatized 12-year-old with trust issues. The third placement was perhaps the worst. The Morrison family in Vancouver, Washington, saw me as a monthly check rather than a human being. Their eyes held the same cold calculation I'd seen in my father's face, and I realized that some people were born to exploit, while others were destined to be used. Each night, I drew pictures of houses, real homes where children were safe and loved. My sketches became more detailed, more architectural, as if I could design my way into belonging. Elena Rodriguez changed everything. As a social worker who actually cared, she recognized something in my detailed drawings that others had missed. "You have a gift, Isabella," she told me one afternoon as we sat in her downtown Portland office. "And I know someone who could nurture it." That someone was Jameson Thorne, a retired architect whose arts and crafts home in the West Hills overlooked the Willamette River like a guardian watching over the city. Jameson's house was everything mine had never been. Built in 1915, it featured wide porches, exposed wooden beams, and a library that stretched floor to ceiling. The scent of cedar, old books, and herbal tea created an atmosphere of scholarly warmth. When Elena brought me for the first visit, Jameson didn't interview me like a candidate. Instead, he handed me a pencil and asked me to draw what home felt like. Moving in with Jameson felt like stepping into a dream I didn't dare trust. He gave me my own room and asked what color I wanted the walls. No one had ever asked my preference about anything. I chose a soft sage green, and he spent an entire weekend helping me paint, sharing stories about famous buildings and the architects who designed them. When nightmares plagued my sleep, I'd find warm cocoa and a flannel blanket waiting outside my door. He never asked questions, never demanded gratitude. He simply provided consistency. Our expeditions around Portland became my education in more than architecture. At Pioneer Courthouse Square, Jameson explained how public spaces could foster community. Standing before the Pittock Mansion, he taught me about proportion, light, and how buildings could reflect the aspirations of their creators. In the Japanese garden, he showed me how landscape and structure could work in harmony. "Architecture isn't just about buildings, Isabella," he'd say. "It's about creating spaces where human souls can flourish." At Roosevelt High School, I met Zoe Chen, a fierce Korean-American girl who refused to let me hide in corners. "You draw all these amazing buildings," she said one day, examining my sketchbook. "Why don't you ever talk about them?" Zoe dragged me into the architecture club, encouraged me to enter design competitions, and slowly coaxed my voice from its protective shell. With her friendship and Jameson's guidance, I began to imagine a future where my past was just prologue. Cornell University's acceptance letter arrived on a gray February morning. When Jameson hung it proudly in the living room, I saw tears in his eyes for the first time. "You're going to design buildings that matter," he told me, "spaces that heal instead of harm." His pride felt foreign and wonderful, like sunlight after years of shadows. College in Ithaca opened worlds I'd never imagined. I devoured courses in sustainable design, urban planning, and environmental psychology. My thesis project focused on transitional housing for aged-out foster youth, drawing from experiences I'd lived but rarely discussed. Professors praised my intuitive understanding of how physical spaces could impact emotional well-being. I graduated summa cum laude, but Jameson's presence at commencement meant more than any academic honor. Returning to Portland, I joined a firm specializing in community development. My designs caught attention quickly. I created a literacy center in North Portland that felt more like a living room than an institution. A community garden pavilion in Southeast became a gathering place for neighbors who'd never spoken before. Each project reinforced my belief that architecture could create connection in a disconnected world. Jameson's illness arrived like a thief: pancreatic cancer, stage 4, inoperable. I took leave from my position to care for him, reading architectural journals aloud as he grew weaker. In his final weeks, as morphine made speaking difficult, he gripped my hand with surprising strength. "Build something that lasts forever, Isabella," he whispered. "Something bigger than both of us," I promised, not knowing then how literally I'd fulfill that vow. He died on a Tuesday morning in early October, autumn light streaming through the bedroom windows. I held his hand as his breathing slowed, then stopped, feeling as if the universe had shifted on its axis. The man who'd saved me, who'd shown me that love could exist without conditions, was gone. The reading of Jameson's will took place in his attorney's downtown office. Margaret Walsh, who'd handled his legal affairs for decades, wore an expression I couldn't decipher as she opened the sealed envelope. "To Isabella Rose Vance," she began, and my heart stopped. The sum was incomprehensible: $27 million, plus the house, plus his architectural archives, everything. The Portland Tribune ran the story on page 3. "Young architect inherits thorn fortune." Within hours, my phone began ringing with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Investment advisors, distant relatives I'd never met, and charitable organizations suddenly found me fascinating. But it was the knock on my door 3 days later that changed everything. Victor Vance stood on Jameson's porch, older and more weathered than I remembered, but his eyes held the same calculating gleam. He wasn't alone. A sharp-suited man introduced himself as William Harrison, family attorney. "Isabella?" Victor said, attempting a smile that never reached his eyes. "We need to talk. About family. About what's right." I didn't invite them in. Standing in the doorway of the home where I'd finally learned to feel safe, I listened as Victor spun a tale of regret and redemption. The years had been hard, he claimed. Mistakes were made. Blood was thicker than water. Harrison nodded along, occasionally mentioning legal precedents and moral obligations. They spoke of family legacy and rightful inheritance, as if the money had always belonged to them. "I've been waiting for the right time to reconnect," Victor lied smoothly. "This tragedy, losing your adoptive father, it's brought everything into perspective. His performance was polished, practiced, but I'd learned to recognize predators in expensive clothing." After they left, I hired Marcus Webb, a private investigator whose office sat above a Thai restaurant in the Hawthorne district. His report arrived 2 weeks later in a manila envelope that felt heavy with truth. Victor's gambling debts exceeded $200,000. He'd lost the family home to foreclosure, burned through Maria's inheritance from her parents, and systematically borrowed from friends until no one would return his calls. Elijah and Leo had both cut contact after Victor's increasingly desperate requests for money. The documentation was thorough and damning. Police reports from casinos, court filings, a trail of financial destruction spanning years. My brothers had escaped to college and never looked back, changing their phone numbers when Victor's demands became too persistent. Even Maria had filed for legal separation, unable to watch him destroy what remained of their lives. Reading Webb's report in Jameson's study, surrounded by architectural books and the faint smell of his pipe tobacco, I felt the last traces of daughterly obligation dissolve. The man who'd discarded me like unwanted furniture now wanted to claim pieces of the life I'd built from nothing. But I was no longer the terrified 12-year-old he'd abandoned. Our final confrontation took place in Margaret Walsh's conference room, a space designed to intimidate with its mahogany table and floor-to-ceiling law books. Victor arrived 20 minutes late, as if his time were more valuable than everyone else's. He wore his best suit, probably borrowed, and carried himself with false confidence. "This is about family, Isabella," he began before anyone else could speak. "About doing what's right. That money represents our legacy, our future together." Harrison opened his briefcase, producing documents that supposedly proved some legal claim to Jameson's estate. I slid Webb's investigative report across the polished table without saying a word. Victor's face cycled through confusion, recognition, and finally panic as he thumbed through the pages. Every debt, every lie, every manipulation was documented in black and white. "You gave up all rights to me the day you signed those papers," I said, my voice steady despite the thundering of my heart. "You never came looking for me until there was money involved. I owe you absolutely nothing." Victor's mask finally slipped. Gone was the remorseful father act, replaced by raw desperation. "You can't turn your back on your own blood," he snarled. "I'm your father. That money should be mine." The entitlement in his voice, the assumption that biology trumped abandonment, confirmed everything I'd suspected about his motivations. "I'll make you one offer," I said, as he struggled to compose himself. "I'll pay for addiction treatment. If you want any kind of future, it won't come through me. It'll come through getting help." The suggestion hit him like a physical blow. The idea that he needed fixing, that his problems were of his own making, seemed genuinely surprising to him. Victor stormed out without another word, Harrison scrambling to follow. Through the conference room windows, I watched them argue on the sidewalk below, their partnership dissolving in real time. I felt lighter than I had in weeks, as if a door I'd been holding closed had finally locked permanently. The Thorne Family Futures Foundation launched 6 months later. Our first project was a transitional housing complex in Portland's Central East Side, designed specifically for teenagers aging out of the foster care system. 20 apartments, each thoughtfully designed with built-in storage, efficient kitchens, and large windows that brought in natural light. The ground floor featured a community center, tutoring rooms, and counseling offices. I walked through the construction site every week, watching walls rise and spaces take shape. The building's exterior blended historic brick with modern glass, creating something both timeless and contemporary. Inside, warm wood tones and abundant natural light would make residents feel welcomed rather than warehoused. Every detail reflected my understanding of how environment shaped experience. Leo contacted me during construction. My middle brother, now a software engineer in Seattle, had read about the foundation in an online article. Our coffee meeting in Pioneer Square was awkward at first. 15 years of separation creating careful distance. But as he talked about his own struggles with Victor's manipulation, I began to see him not as the favored son, but as another survivor of our father's emotional abuse. "I've felt guilty about you for years," Leo admitted, stirring sugar into his latte. "I knew what he was doing wasn't right, but I was too young to do anything about it. Then I was too ashamed to reach out." His confession opened a door I'd thought permanently sealed. We began talking regularly, building a relationship based on choice rather than obligation. The housing complex's grand opening took place on a crisp November morning. Mayor Wheeler offered remarks about community investment and second chances. Local news crews captured footage of young people touring their new homes, keys gleaming in their hands. But the moment that mattered most came when I stood at the podium, looking out at faces that reflected my own teenage desperation and hope. "Family isn't about blood," I told the assembled crowd. "It's about choice, commitment, and love. When we choose each other, we build something stronger than any inheritance. We build a future." The silver key pendant Jameson had given me caught the light as I spoke, a symbol of doors he'd opened and doors I was now opening for others. 6 months later, I received an email from Chloe Martinez, one of the complex's first residents. She'd enrolled in community college and landed an internship at a local architecture firm. "Thank you for believing in us," she wrote, "for creating a place where we could believe in ourselves." Her words felt like validation of every difficult decision I'd made. Victor never took me up on the treatment offer. According to Leo, he'd moved to Las Vegas, chasing bigger games and longer odds. Maria had remarried a gentleman who taught high school history, finding in her 60s the stability she'd never known. My father remained a ghost of addiction and entitlement, haunting casino floors and burning whatever bridges still existed. Standing in my office 5 years later, looking out at Portland's skyline where several of my buildings now stood, I reflected on the architecture of my own life. The foundation had expanded to 3 states, housing over 200 young people transitioning to independence. My architectural firm specialized in trauma-informed design, creating spaces that promoted healing and growth. The scared 12-year-old who'd been discarded like garbage had become a woman who transformed abandonment into purpose. I'd built a legacy not of blood and obligation, but of choice and compassion. The $27 million had been seed money for something Jameson could never have imagined, a family of choice that spanned generations and geography. Sometimes, late at night when the city lights twinkled below, I'd remember that terrified girl drawing houses in foster care, desperate to design herself into belonging. She could never have imagined that her abandonment would become her architecture, that her wounds would become her wisdom. The Vance family had discarded me, but in doing so, they'd unknowingly created something far more powerful than they'd ever been. I was no longer Isabella Vance, unwanted daughter. I was Isabella Thorne, chosen daughter and chosen mother to hundreds. In losing one family, I'd gained the ability to create families for others. It was, I realized, the most beautiful revenge possible. Not destroying my enemies, but rendering them irrelevant through the simple act of building something better.